The AMOC could shut down. This is, and I really don't think this is an exaggeration, one of climate scientists' biggest fears. An overheating planet could cause this vast ocean circulation to grind to a halt, causing major and largely irreversible disruption to the planet's weather patterns. And if you've seen headlines like these or videos like these, you'll know that the fears are rising. But if you've just read these headlines, you might think that the science is settled, that the AMOC collapse is coming and that there's nothing we can do about it. But I reached out to a bunch of scientists who are still battling to understand how big the threat is. And one of the few things that they do agree on is that we can still act to protect ourselves. I'm Adam, I have a PhD in atmospheric physics, and I'm here to help you make sense of the changing planet that we all share. Today, I want to take a look at one of the most critical but complex questions in climate science, whether a massive ocean circulation, the AMOC, will collapse. I want to talk to you about what we know, what we don't, and how we, personally, can start to make sense of this immense threat. I actually made a video about this a couple of years ago, but there've been a bunch of updates. Spoiler alert, they're not happy updates, but they're not as unambiguously bad as you'd think if you just read the headlines. So the AMOC is the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation. It's the Atlantic section of the ocean's vast conveyor belt, and the word vast doesn't really do it justice. It carries over 1 million billion watts of heat across the globe. If that number doesn't help you, and it doesn't really help me, then picture the output of 1 million power plants. Yeah, it's still kind of hard to get your head around. By transporting these unbelievable amounts of heat towards the north of our planet, the AMOC regulates the world's climate. This is especially important for keeping Europe's climate relatively mild, but as we'll see in a second, it has impacts far further afield as well. So all in all, the AMOC is extremely important. 5 out of 5 no notes would circulate again. But, and I guess you can see where this is going, climate change comes in and says, that's a pretty nice overturning circulation you've got there. Shame if someone were to switch it off. Well, I guess today we learned what my brain thinks climate change's voice sounds like. If, hypothetically, humans were to emit a bunch of greenhouse gases, those would heat the planet up, changing how the ocean loses heat. Plus, it would cause the Greenland ice sheet to melt and dump a whole bunch of fresh water into the North Atlantic. And all of that would disrupt how the AMOC does its whole overturning circulation thing and slow the whole system down. And when I said hypothetically, what I meant is that is exactly what we're currently doing and what climate scientists are scared will happen. Now, the AMOC slowing down would be bad enough, but the biggest fear is that if things slow down enough, the AMOC could reach a tipping point. Tipping points are points in our climate system where, once passed, the planet would tip into another state, and it would be very hard to get back to where we started. For the AMOC, the fear is that the circulation could effectively shut down, switching to a much less active state that would be tough to switch back on. Now, often this collapse is depicted as something sudden, as if the AMOC could shut down overnight, like in The Day After Tomorrow when Jake Gyllenhaal is literally chased by the cold. In reality, though, it would be several decades between passing the tipping point and a full shutdown. As we'll talk about in a second, there's still a lot of questions and debate between researchers about what's going on with the AMOC. But there are two things all the scientists seem to agree on. One is good and one is bad. The bad thing that they agree on is that if the AMOC substantially slowed or even shut down, that would be devastating. It could cause things like sea levels to soar on the east coast of America, temperatures to plunge in Europe, bringing about extreme, brutal winters, disruptions in rainfall patterns, including to monsoon rains that millions rely on. It's worth emphasizing as well that our societies just aren't adapted to any of that and wouldn't be able to change to keep up. We've spent millennia building our civilizations based on a particular climate, and then, if triggered, an AMOC shutdown could take place in just 50 to 100 years, completely disrupting the global climate that our farming, our cities, our ecosystems are adapted to. In general, when I talk to scientists, they're often wary about using big emotional language. So when I asked whether an AMOC shutdown would indeed be catastrophic, I was pretty struck by how clear their answers were. Collapse would definitely be catastrophic. Major and widespread climate consequences, and results show quite catastrophic impacts. Oh, and if you want to read the researchers' full responses to my questions, as well as links to plenty more reading about the AMOC, I've popped the links down below. But like I said, there is a good thing that scientists agree on too, and I'll be getting to that in a minute. Okay, but we know that if the AMOC slowed or stalled, that would be bad news. But working out what will actually happen is, to use the scientific term, really bloody hard. The circulation is huge. Even measuring what it's doing today is difficult. We only have decent measurements of the circulation for 22 odd years, a blink of an eye in the timescales of the AMOC. In comparison, it takes water around 1,000 years to get around the entire ocean conveyor. So, without enough direct evidence, researchers have instead been using circumstantial evidence to understand what the AMOC's up to. Looking at things like the temperature of the ocean's surface and how much heat is transferred between air and water, or looking back to the more distant past, clues left behind in natural materials like ocean sediments. Evidence is building that climate change has already substantially weakened the AMOC, but some researchers still argue that this slowdown could be a natural shift, and others argue we can't even say if it's changed yet. So if it's hard to work out what's already happening, it's of course hard to say what's going to happen. We need to take what evidence we have from the past and from today and combine that with computer simulations of the future. Now, for a long time, this would be where I'd do my reassuring bit. I'd explained that in the latest IPCC report, which summed up the state of climate science in 2021, the research indicated that while a decline of the AMOC is very likely, there was medium confidence that a collapse wouldn't happen this century. This would mean the odds aren't too high, but the risk is still so big that we need to take it very seriously. Except, here's the thing. The more scientists study the AMOC, the more we learn, the higher the odds of a collapse start to seem. You might have got this sense if you've seen some of the latest, frankly, pretty fear-inducing headlines based on a recent study. This study looked at simulations where computers use our understanding of the physical processes of the oceans and atmosphere to see how the planet, including the AMOC, would change as we keep heating things up. Now, these simulations aren't perfect. Each computer model does things a bit differently, and the simulation's predictions for the AMOC's future were pretty all over the place. They generally showed it getting weaker, but by massively different amounts. Now, clearly, some of these simulations of the future must be more accurate than others, but how do we tell which ones? To work that out, researchers looked at how well the computer models compared to important observations of the Atlantic Ocean today. This allowed them to pick out what they hope are the best simulations. And when they did that, this narrowed down the answer and made the answer far more bleak. These models simulated the AMOC strength dropping by about half by the end of this century. That forecast is around 60% worse than when averaging across all the simulations. Now, this is pretty bad news. It suggests that the AMOC is far less stable than we'd previously understood, than we'd previously hoped. Still though, the study rests on the assumption that computer simulations can accurately capture what's in store for the AMOC, and of course that this approach did indeed select the most accurate computer models. Now these are pretty big ifs. But I don't want to spend too long talking about this one specific study, because the reality is that it's part of a pattern. There have been a bunch of studies over the past few years using different methods and bringing bad news about the AMOC. Like the study that showed that if we look into the more distant future, say to the year 2300, a shutdown becomes much more likely. Or studies that use either physics or statistics to argue that the AMOC is already on course for a tipping point. All these studies have made headlines, and for good reason. The consequences would be really, really bad. In fact, we're also learning more and more about just how bad the consequences could be. New research indicates that the disruptions to the ocean would also lead to our seas releasing large amounts of carbon dioxide, disrupting our climate even further. Another study showed that AMOC shutdowns, as the world left the last ice age, had devastating chilling effects on European winters. So, lots of bad news. But the truth is, these aren't the only studies from the past few years. There have also been studies calling the AMOC collapse into question, like one that showed that even though the AMOC could weaken substantially, simulations don't show it shutting down. Or the study that tried to unpick the last 60 years of the circulation and found that it hadn't started to decline yet. Now, these slightly reassuring studies do also make headlines, but I've had the impression that they get covered a bunch less, and a couple of the researchers I spoke with felt similarly. I'm genuinely curious what your experience is. Have you heard about AMOC collapse before? And if so, what combination of bad and not so bad news have you seen out there? Oh, and if you are going to leave a comment, you might as well click on the like and subscribe buttons too. It makes a huge difference to getting these videos out there and will help keep you in the loop on what's actually going on with climate change. So the research on a possible AMOC collapse is definitely still somewhat nuanced. It's not the case that it's all pointing to it looking more likely as we gather more evidence. For something as massive, complex, and that we've been studying for so little time, it probably shouldn't come as a surprise that we don't have definitive answers. And this was reflected in the answers from the researchers I spoke with. One said they view a collapse this century as unlikely. Another said the odds of reaching a tipping point this century looked more like 50-50, though the tip itself would then take around a century or so to unfold. So, based on everything I've read and everyone I've spoken to, we still have to say that we still don't know what's in store for the AMOC. But the amount of bad news is certainly beginning to add up. Where before we thought a collapse was devastating but unlikely, the evidence from the past 5 years or so means we now have to accept that it's looking more and more devastating and that it's a very real possibility. Stalwart AMOC researcher Stefan Rahmsdorf told The Guardian that a collapse has to be avoided at all costs. I argued this when we thought the chance of an AMOC shutdown was maybe 5%, and even then we were saying that risk is too high given the massive impacts. Now it looks like it's more than 50%. Okay, I promise that we're almost at the good thing that scientists agree on. Okay, let's be real. What the hell are normal people like us meant to do when confronted by this information? I can't tell you how to feel, but I can tell you how I feel when I look through this literature. I genuinely feel an overturning in my stomach, an unease made up of a mixture of fear and anger. One of the things making it tough is how high the stakes are, and yet how uncertain all of this is. It may seem weird that different scientists are saying different things, but this is how science works when something is still being worked out. We gather as much evidence as we can, and when there's not enough watertight evidence, we look for clues wherever we can find them. But some of these clues might point us in different directions, and it takes time to unpick all that. And that's kind of the point in this channel. I feel like it's vitally important to peer behind the headlines and confront that nuance. And since I don't sell you all rubbish that you don't need through product placements or monetization, my ability to make videos like this is entirely down to incredible patrons like Elia J. Scott. Head up here to join the team of Climates. Now, the lack of clarity on the AMOC reminds us just how important continued climate research is. I mean, sure, as a climate scientist by training, I'm definitely biased, but hey, we all live on this planet. I do think it would be objectively neat to know if a vast ocean current with profound influence on our entire climate were about to collapse. So when I mention this feeling of anger, it's partly coming from knowing that we know what we don't know and how important it is to research it. And then also knowing that climate research itself is currently under attack, especially in the United States, to an extent that we've never seen before. Basically, what I'm saying is, when climate science funding is cut, that's not just a shame for climate nerds, it endangers all of us. Research isn't just about sounding the alarm for the AMOC. It could even point to some kind of intervention that could try to protect the circulation. Like some research suggests, closing the Bering Strait could prevent a shutdown of the circulation. Though it's important to point out that 1, this research is in its infancy, and 2, it's a pretty bonkers idea. There are big questions over important little things like whether it would be at all feasible and if there could be major unintended impacts. Okay, so that idea is another thing that I'm sure climate scientists do not agree on. But like I say, they do largely agree that a shutdown would be catastrophic. So let's finally get on to the good agreement. Every climate scientist I've spoken to, every study I've looked at, confirms what we need to do to lower our risks, limit the amount of greenhouse gases we pump into the atmosphere. Now, this might sound obvious, but it's important to translate that message to your personal reaction. Sometimes when we hear news like this, we feel that fear and anger, and then we shut down. But if we do shut down, we're doing the worst possible thing. We're doing nothing. We know that the more we emit, the more risk we have of the AMOC slowing and maybe even shutting down. Scary moments like these remind us, as if we needed a reminder, why it's so incredibly important to halt emissions and limit climate change. Speaking of which, right now scientists are debating whether we might be on the brink of a very different kind of tipping point. As conflicts and genocide rage on, fuel prices remain brutally high across the world, and the world is responding. From countries doubling down on plans for renewables, to people like you and me investing in low-carbon tech, things like heat pumps, solar panels, and electric vehicles. These low emissions options were completely unaffordable for the vast majority of people just a few years ago, and now they're rapidly becoming the norm. And for the first time last year, evidence suggests that renewables grew so much that fossil fuel electricity generation dropped. We, and I mean you and me, have a chance right now to contribute to the shifting currents of our energy system. Whether that's by working to bring down our own emissions, taking actions to push for the changes we need from the top, or sharing vital information about our climate. For example, a nuanced, detailed video from a climate scientist all about the AMOC, just as a random idea. But for real, I can't tell you what you ought to be doing. It depends so heavily on the specifics of your life and what's available to you. But I can tell you that when it comes to our climate, the worst thing you can do is shut down in the face of frightening headlines. And if you want to get a sense of just how much the world's energy systems are changing, how fast, then check out my video on how Trump has just, maybe, accidentally become the world's most effective climate activist. Okay, until next time. Bye. How can I not push a globe off a table?